The peoples of the plateau had survived the conquest of Alexander and absorbed the conquest of Islam, but they were now to face a new form of barbarous invasion from the east, not once but twice, perhaps the most shattering invaders and raiders in history, the Mongols of Genghis Khan and then Tamerlane. The test of survival could scarcely have been harsher or more severe. But this is not only the story of a Holocaust, it's also a story which focuses on one of the eternal enigmas of history and of human nature, how the savage and the civilized man could appear and disappear, exist and coexist within one or two generations and within the same family.
At the beginning of the 13th century, the world of the Persian peasant was confined, as it always had been, to the horizons of the land he worked. Dynasties could come and go, but the working of the land had to continue. A Persian king once made the point, the monarchy depends on the army on money. Money comes from the land tax comes from agriculture. Barely half the land could grow anything. The balance between fertility and drought was precarious. Life depended on keeping that balance in place. There was a constant struggle to keep the desert at bay. A year of neglect or the disturbance of an invasion could produce a decade of famine. In this delicately balanced world, country and town had to coexist. The lives of the country and the town met in the bazaar. When other institutions broke down, the bazaar carried on. It demonstrated how people depended on one another. But beyond the town and beyond the villages, there was another community in this social alliance, the pastoral nomads. Much of the harder land of the Iranian plateau can support only nomadic grazing and nothing else. In the summer, they graze the cooler highlands. In the winter, they migrate to the warmer lowlands. It is a life for only the fittest. The life of the nomad is as old as Persia itself. The tribes who built the first Persian empire, the Medes and the Persians, migrated to the plateau as nomads from the steppes. In the nomadic life, everything must be mobile. Flocks, families, possessions. Early in the 11th century, a prolific Turkish clan called the Seljuks filtered piecemeal into Persia from the northeast as part of a sustained migration of the steppe peoples onto the plateau. Having come to graze, they conquered. Having conquered, they settled. With their patronage, the Persians produced architectural masterpieces. And when the Seljuks became Muslim, they promoted strict orthodoxy. Their belief expressed itself in the definitive Persian mosque. the arcaded courtyard, the great open arch, or Evan, leading to a sanctuary under the dome. This is the Seljuks' greatest work, part of the Friday Mosque in Isfahan. The essence of Seljuk building was the use of bricks, not just for structure, but to give patterns to the pillars, arches, walls, and domes. In barely a century of rule, the people who came as nomads had enriched the arts of the city. This sacred bowl was inscribed by a Seljuk calligrapher.
This world is a bridge that you cross to the next world.
The Seljuk rulers were absorbed by the settled society and into constant struggles for kingship. To the Persian peasant in the fields, the familiar cycle of one dynasty following another seemed like the cycle of the seasons, as inevitable as testing. In 1206, the Mongolian year of the tiger, all the nomadic tribes of the steppes of Eastern Asia were called to a great assembly. For the first time, they agreed to unite under one banner, a white standard edged with 9 yak's tails, and under one leader. His name was really Temujin, but they called him Genghis Khan. There had always been a great gap in Persia's natural defenses, the northeast. Through this border ran the trade route from China and India to Europe, providing rich pickings in trade and customs. But the route was vulnerable to raiders from the steppes. Instead of a mountain barrier, instead of a desert, there was an inviting sweep of grazing land right into the plateau itself. Every influx from the steppes had come through here and down into the open pastures. But there had never before been a nomadic force like the Mongols, never one as large, never one as well led, never one moving so fast. This staging post and royal palace was probably one of the first buildings encountered by the Mongols as they entered eastern Persia. Mongol army had matchless discipline. It was organized so that every man knew his place, whatever the action. They operated in decimal units, from tens of thousands to hundreds to 10. These attacks were not random and wild butchery by an army out of control. They were deliberate and systematic to exact command. As part of their military training, when they hunted animals, the Mongols selected them, encircled them, herded them together, and killed them. With people, they were equally methodical, equally thorough. No mortal was spared. On occasions, they even returned to the site to pick off any survivors. The balance between city, village and nomad was broken. As they had selected their human targets, the Mongols also selected towns and cities for destruction. A fugitive of the time said, "They came, they sapped, they burnt, they slew, they plundered, they departed." To make doubly sure, they even salted the earth. Behind the Mongol war machine was a life of extraordinary self-sufficiency. Mobility was the key to their life in war and peace. Most of what they needed, they took with them. Mobility was their great strength. They could plunder and pass on. In contrast, the people of the settled societies were lost once their centers were destroyed. An Arab chronicler lamented,
If anyone were to say that at no time since the creation of man by the great God had the world experienced anything like it, he would only be telling the truth.
Within very few years, the Mongols had an empire that stretched from Korea to Germany. Persia was only a part of a world catastrophe. But Persia showed how deep was the blow, not only in lives, but in the obliteration of those things which had enriched civilization. 6 centuries of creative effort had given Islamic Persia a superb culture. 6 months of the Mongol war machine was enough to smash it. Nothing, not a trace, remained of the university city of Nishapur, which stood on this site beneath the modern city. Its university was destroyed forever, the whole population slaughtered, even the cats and the dogs. The Mongols had swept down from the steppes, along the Silk Route through Bukhara and Samarkand. They selected the richest targets in the rich northern part of Iran. Nishapur, Herat, and Ray were destroyed. Once, Chinggis Khan rode into what he thought was a sultan's palace. Told it was the house of God, he said, "The countryside is empty of fodder. Fill our horses' bellies." The cases holding copies of the Holy Koran were emptied and used as mangers. Here, at the Mosque of Ray, the nature and sanctity of Islam was equally incomprehensible to the raiders. The arts of Islam reflected the richness of the influence which had been reconciled within a universal culture. But it was a culture that had no military answer to the Mongols, who reduced it to ceramic dust. From Ray, the Mongols swept on through the plains to the west. Overlooking their route, Dr. Robert Hillenbrand of Edinburgh University.
What was it, do you think, Robert, that made the Mongols so brutal, so destructive, so savage?
Well, I think they were a different kind of enemy, and they waged a different kind of war from that which the Islamic world had known up till that date. The aim of their conquest seems to have been to eradicate the means of recovery. Total war.
But total war in order to achieve what?
That's something of a puzzle. You would have thought that if the Mongols knew they were going to stay, they wouldn't have destroyed the country to that extent. But destroy it they did.
And as we sit here overlooking the plains, one wonders, why did they come here when they were going to destroy so much as soon as they arrived?
Well, the old 19th century argument was that they needed grazing for their horses, but their horses must have needed massive appetites to go on eating all the way to Hungary. It's much more likely that it was a direct result of the unprecedented unity of the Mongols under Chinggis Khan. And the power that this gave them, this sense of divine mission, can be compared to that of the Arabs under Muhammad and his immediate successors.
The Mongol conquests continued under Chinggis Khan's successors. One of his grandsons, Hulagu, was given 2 targets. The first was this mountain redoubt in Persia, home of a fanatical sect called the Ismailis. For nearly 2 centuries, the Ismailis had sent out assassins from here to kill religious opponents, even those in heavily guarded palaces. Hulagu laid siege to the mountain fortress. using catapults and flaming missiles, devices learned from the Chinese. The Ismailis were massacred, and Hulagu turned to his next target, the great Muslim capital of Baghdad.
The Mongol army continued west. Baghdad fell and Hulagu rolled up the map of Eastern Islam. But the army of the Mamluks defeated the Mongols in 1260 on the brink of Egypt. The Islamic world was split in two. Cairo was its western focus. Hulagu controlled the east. The Mongol conquest of the Middle East had reached its limits. Gradually, Hulagu and his followers were to adapt to settled life as colonial rulers. But they came ill-equipped for it. Their beliefs had been shaped by the rude, open world of the steppes. Their religion, shamanism, was built around elemental ritual. The demons had to be repulsed by the shaman divines, who guided a highly superstitious society. It was they who read the signs, sought to rescue the souls of the sick, and wrestled with the perils of nomadic life. It was death for Mongols to wash in rivers, urinate in wells, or to choke while eating. Mongol society was centered on their tent, the yurt, a lattice cone covered in felt. Yurts could be up to 30 feet wide, but portable, carried on carts. It was the anchor of an otherwise fluid life. The transition from the yurt to the city was a step from one culture to another. In making it, the Mongols became different people. Their first major capital city in Persia was here, in Tabriz. The destroyers had become builders. It is the nature of this transition, which is considered by Professor Bernard Lewis of Princeton University.
From savage invaders to settlers, Professor Lewis, what happened to the Mongols?
Well, I wouldn't quite see it in that way. By the time they got to Iran, they were no longer savage invaders. One must remember that the Mongols had conquered a large part of China. Before they ever entered Iran, they had already conquered much of Eastern Europe.
They behaved pretty savagely on arrival, though, didn't they?
Oh, yes. Their military methods, shall we say, were thoroughly modern. They did enormous damage, but on the whole, I think one must say that the damage that they did was purposeful and organized. It was not the random destruction of the barbarian. They used the
But is that any defense? Hitler's genocide of the Jews was also organized rather than random.
I'm not trying to defend it. I'm merely trying to explain the difference between primitive barbarians and the behavior of an organized state.
Granted, they're not simple barbarian hordes, however. The very fact that they're better organized doesn't mean that they were any less destructive, does it?
No,
more destructive, probably.
More efficiently destructive.
And less excusable.
Excusable, yes. I don't like to look at this in terms of making moral judgments on what the Mongols did in the 13th century. I feel that the business of the historian is to understand and as far as possible to explain rather than to pass moral judgments. I would neither condemn nor excuse them.
So from your point of view, one of the key things as you see it is that they didn't come from nowhere and that they'd organized their empire very well.
You can see the influence of Chinese civilization in Persia in this period for the first time. You can see it quite plainly in Persian art, not only in the Far Eastern features and costume, but also in certain stylistic influences. This is the most obvious, the most visible form, but there are many others. I think one can trace Far Eastern elements in the new type of bureaucratic organization which evolves after the Mongols.
To run Persia, the Mongol kings also needed the local bureaucrats, who had always reassembled the state after invasions. They regained influence and power and re-established central control. But the Mongol court was slowly changing. Mongol women had fought in the armies and had a high degree of independence. Instead of the furs of the steppes, they took to wearing fine Chinese silks. The Mongol Empire was divided into 4 domains, each ruled by a branch of the Mongol royal family, responsible to the great Khans in China. Persia was granted to Hulegu and his descendants called the Ilkhans. All the overland routes of Asia were now under one empire, and Tabriz was astride the main artery between East and West, where ambassadors from China and Edward I of England rubbed shoulders. It opened up the world to ideas like printing and paper money, which came first from China. The city was thick with the passage of different worlds: Venetians, Chinese, Arabs, Turks, Indians, Byzantines, Russians, and Armenians. Through the tradesmen of the bazaar passed fine silks, precious stones, porcelain, fruit, and spices. The merchants of the bazaar joined the bureaucrats in an alliance with their Mongol king, now less the alien, more the Persian monarch.
And here I think it's important to draw attention to the role of the Turkish peoples. Now the Turks, for the most part, were already Muslim. The Turks had been there longer. The Turks had been living side by side for a couple of centuries with the Persians. And there was already in existence what one might call a Perso-Turkish culture, Islamic by religion, Persian or Turkish in language. And the Turks thus served culturally too as intermediaries between the Mongols and the Persians. And they helped in the assimilation of the Mongols, who found it easier once they had lost their Mongol identity. The Mongol language disappeared fairly soon.
But the real hurdle for the Mongols in coming to terms with Persia was the religion. The first of the line of Muslim rulers, Kazan, gradually replaced the Mongol customs with the laws of Islam. His brother built the stucco mehrab. To pray towards this niche is to pray towards Mecca. The Mongols had long vacillated over which faith to adopt. They had toyed with Buddhism and Christianity before finally entering Orthodox Islam. But the Persians had had to survive the devastations. Many withdrew into the traditional mystic path of Islam, Sufism. Their rituals induced the ecstasy in which they found God. The poet Sa'adi said at the time,
"Who washes his hands of life says whatever he has in his heart."
What about the interaction between the Mongols and the Persians? Who did what and with which and to whom?
Well, they affected each other, of course. The Mongols didn't bring a great deal with them by way of cultural baggage. They did bring some elements of Far Eastern civilization, as I said. Genghis Khan was always accompanied by his Chinese advisor. But once the Mongols settled in Iran, it was, of course, the local civilization which most affected them.
Of all the Persian characteristics and traditions, which would you say had the greatest impact on the Mongols?
On the Mongols who remained in Persia, that is, because obviously the others were not very much affected. Ultimately, their art, their architecture, their literature, and their administrative practices. These, of course, were very much affected by the Mongols, but the Mongols, too, adopted many of these things. But if we speak of the Mongols resident in Persia, converted to Islam, who had forgotten the Mongol language, and who in time forgot their Mongol identity, they became Iranians. They ceased to be Mongol in any meaningful sense. I mean, there comes a point in English history when you no longer distinguish between Anglo-Saxons and Normans.
Perhaps the greatest symbol of Persia's resurrection and of what happened to the Mongols when they put down roots was this: the mausoleum of Oljetu, a Mongol king. It took thousands of craftsmen to build it, and it's taking a team of international architects years just to restore it. Robert, you've described this place as almost a sort of early Taj Mahal. What is it that makes it so unique?
Well, essentially, it's a building that's far ahead of its time. In fact, it sets the style for later Persian building, and this on all sorts of counts. First of all, it's an extraordinary feat of structural engineering. It's far ahead of its time as a building of this size. There was nothing of this size erected either before or even after this period. So, in a real sense, the whole of Iranian architecture stands in the shadow of this building. It's got an immense complexity, both internally and externally, both in structure and decoration. In fact, one of its great strengths is the way that structure and decoration are in perfect equilibrium. You don't feel that structure dominates at the expense of decoration or vice versa. Take a look internally, for example, the way that the whole building has an extraordinary airiness, lightness, and grace. The way that this vast space is repeatedly divided up by windows, by niches, columns, all kinds of architectural features. And yet, even though the walls are constantly broken up in this way, nevertheless, there's a tremendous sense of mass, of heaviness, of content in the building.
Well, at that point, Robert, let's take a look higher up, if we may. Tell me, the place is absolutely full of scaffolding at the moment. Did they have scaffolding in those days?
Oh, yes, they would have had scaffolding, not metal scaffolding, of course. Wood scaffolding all the way up to the top of the building when decoration was being applied, and they don't even plug the scaffolding holes. So even to this day, you find holes left where scaffolding used to be.
What would have been the biggest problem in 1310, I mean, in terms of building something as massive as this, in terms of getting the structure right so that it didn't fall down? I mean, what was the most important thing? The 8 pillars, or what? What was the key to it?
The key to it was the dome, which we rightly regard as the crown of the whole building. In fact, the resemblance to a crown would have been even stronger when the 8 minarets around it would have been in place. Now they're half shattered, of course. But the big problem was for that dome to stand up, and it stands up by virtue of its perfect profile. The way that it's quite devoid of buttressing, pinnacles, any kind of external support. Its thrusts are all concentrated into the base itself.
Built around 1310, the mausoleum is about 160 feet high. The dome compares with the Pantheon in Rome of 130 AD, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, completed in 1709, and the Capitol in Washington, 1864, which needed iron girders to hold it up. mausoleum once towered over the Ilkhan capital, Sultaniye, but the city has long since gone and only a small village survived. Sultaniye was a city built by royal decree, designed to surpass Tabriz. It never did. It was in the wrong place for trade and offered no extra advantage. Sultaniye took 6 years to build, but the complex restoration work will take more than twice as long.
But there are other problems concerning mainly the decoration of the building, where it wouldn't be so easy to reproduce the old techniques. Take the galleries up there, for example, 24 of them, all with vault patterns in carved and painted plaster that have really no equal anywhere else in Persia, or for that matter in the world. With a gallery like that alone, this building makes its claim to rank among the great buildings of the world.
And what else would you rank with the galleries?
Well, principally the stress on sacred names throughout the interior. The way that the name of God, Allah, leaps to your eye wherever you go throughout the mausoleum. Perhaps on a tiny scale, say the joint between 2 bricks, which is carved with the name of God, or perhaps in letters 2 feet high up on the dome, or on the walls.
Or even in places actually where no one was ever going to see them.
An important point, yes. Yes, so clearly throughout the craftsmen would be preparing all this work for God alone, knowing that they would never ever be appreciated.
And then there are the other sorts of tiles and the terracotta and...
Yes, always this sensitivity to the use of colour, which was later to be a hallmark of Persian architecture, you find expressed here, the way that 1 or 2 colours are made to do the work of a dozen.
The restorers working on the mausoleum wanted to retrieve the exact colors of the 14th century.
Now is a production we are doing. Yes. And you see, we want to reach the same tonality as the ancient one. You can distinguish.
This is, in fact, a modern-day tile which Enrico De Rico and his team have produced to be like these old tiles. Now, this is the one that's how old?
It's 700 years old. 700 years old. It's a piece we removed from the dome.
As you can see, when you look back at this side, you see this is the smoothness of the new tile, and there is the 700-year-old tile. But on the front, they look alike.
The first color used in Persian tiles was blue, but the restorers at Sultaniye could find no modern blue to match the ancient tiles of the dome. They had to experiment themselves. The mixture they devised is kept under lock and key in this workshop.
Now, when you started this work, did you find it difficult to explain exactly what the color was you wanted and so on?
Yeah, for the first I didn't speak the language. For the second, they haven't done before. So joking, I told I won't like my eyes.
Color of your
Color
eyes?
of my eyes.
A sort of bloodshot color.
Yes,
yes, yes.
Only the ancient, original methods will satisfy the restorers, as the secret blend is ground into the liquid glaze for the tiles. The mausoleum was built by as many as 14,000 craftsmen, brought from all over Persia and beyond. Today, the men rebuilding it have left jobs in the fields. To find lost skills has brought difficulties.
What was the difficulty?
The difficulty was to find the exact proportion between the materials used. because just giving less or more could change completely. As you can see, this is just only different proportion of mixture. And you can have, a spot of that is maybe one impurity of oxide of copper.
And you want slightly different colors,
yes,
in the dome?
I want this to give the shape of the dome, because I start with a more dark color and I finish with a more light.
Bundan tutuyor ya.
Ha bundan tutar.
Bundan.
Ha bu tarafı bundan tutar, yarısı bundan tutar, bu tarafı bundan rengi. Bu da onun rengi açık olan bundan tutar.
Bundan tutar.
Ha. Bu da köyne.
Now, what made you dedicate yourself to this mausoleum? What was it about the mausoleum that made you decide to do it?
Well, you can prove the same when you remain alone here. It's a enchanting view. It's a magic thing. It's a landscape, the thing, and loneliness, and something you cannot refuse. When I came, I was going to leave immediately, 24 hours. Then after, I decided to stay a month, and after I spent more than 5 years.
Are you in love with that building?
I think so. I think so. It may be too much. This is a problem.
But soon after the Mongols had been absorbed into Persian life, another ruthless invader came from the east and reached Sultaniye in 1384. He sacked it with little opposition. His name was Timur, romanticized in Western literature as Tamburlaine, Timur the Lame. His eyes were said to be like candles, but opaque, without brilliance. His trail was marked by pyramids of skulls, the fate of any city which dared to resist him. Unlike the Mongols, Timur was a Muslim to begin with, but from his base at Samarkand, he ravaged the Muslim world, claiming he was fighting a holy war against either the infidel or lukewarm Muslims. Herat, Baghdad, Delhi, Ankara, and Damascus fell to him. Once again, the settled people had to submit to the invaders' demands. When the people of the city of Isfahan decided that the price of being spared was too high, they set upon Timur's tax collectors. In reprisal, he sacked the city. And the heads of its citizens were delivered to him with the booty. Timur's invasion was a massive case of cultural rape. He dragooned architects and artisans to one objective: the building and embellishment of a fabulous eastern city, Samarkand. Few of the workers taken to Samarkand ever saw their homeland again. The tyrannical patron got what he intended, an architectural masterpiece, culminating in the fluted dome of his own mausoleum. Timur was a bewildering mixture of savage and sophisticate, reveling as much in the clash of minds as in the clash of swords. His entourage included scholars who debated with him on the sciences, architecture, and especially history. Although illiterate, Timur was said to be as agile mentally as any of his scholars, and played chess with skill. But he was squeamish about the language of the court and forbade obscene talk or talk of bloodshed, rapine, plunder, and the harem. Timur's descendants gradually lost the taste for conquest, and some of them had little interest in governing. But the royal princes became great patrons of the arts. There were workshops composed of Persian calligraphers, illuminators, painters, and binders. The most famous belonged to a grandson of Timur, Baysunkur. In 1430, before the birth of Leonardo, Baysunkur ordered this book of fables, one masterpiece of many. The most glittering monument of this patronage is a mosque bearing the inscription which he personally designed. By Baysunkur, son of Shahrukh, son of Timur, with hope in God. It was named Gohar Shod, after Baysunkur's mother. The religious architecture of Persia became, in the hands of the Timurids, a framework for brilliant decoration. The art historian Robert Byron called this mosque the most beautiful example of color in architecture ever devised by man to the glory of God and himself. The Mongols had changed the world, but they left the people of the plateau neither a language nor a religion. The Timurids were also a passing nightmare. But something was gained out of these ordeals. Persian culture had permeated Eastern Islam. Each wave of destruction was followed by extraordinary bursts of creation, which outlasted the memory of genocide and decimation. The anchor of existence remained the land. Thinking of the source of his taxes, the Mongol king Ghazan had warned his rapacious governors,
"If you insult the peasant, take his oxen and seed and trample his crops into the ground, what will you do in the future?"
Unlike the peasant, the nomads were less vulnerable. They could rule themselves.